Hi and welcome to another training session with Drink Drug Hub. This training session is called Talking to Children and Young People About Drugs, and this session has a trigger warning, and that's because this session will involve discussion about a young person who died after taking drugs. Now, if this is likely to cause you distress, we'd recommend you don't watch the recording. Instead, you can attend a live training session, which you can book at drinkdrughub.co.uk, where all our training sessions are available, in which case a facilitator will be available to support you during or following the session. In the meantime, if we continue with this recording, you'll find we've split this session into three parts. The first part is about barriers to having a conversation, the reasons why we find it difficult to talk to young people about drugs and why they find it difficult to talk to us. Part 2 is about the drugs used by young people and the risks associated with those drugs, and part 3 is about the interventions that are used by schools, and also some tips and guidance on how to discuss drugs as a parent or a professional. And a note on language there: by parent, we refer to parental figure, and that can include carers, guardians, or grandparents and other family members. Now, a little note on some research that you'll come across throughout this session. It's recently been completed by the University of York. It's called Voices of Young People, and it was where researchers working at the York University interviewed 30 children and young people attending drug support services. So what you will find is throughout the session today, we get quotes coming up on the screen like this. These are quotes from young people that we think are really valuable in informing us when it comes to talking to young people about drugs. What we've found with this research is there are a lot of positive comments made by the young people about having a trusted adult in their life, not least because a trusted adult was often the person who would refer them into a drug support service. Here, for instance, is a quote from Rich, age 15, and he's got really positive comments to say about his mother. She said that every time she found out, she'd basically try and put him on the right path, and that's all she's ever tried to do, just trying to do the best thing for him. And we also had quotes from young people about professionals, like Lily here at the age of 14. She says that just being able to speak to somebody about drugs, well, that's really nice to have someone to talk to. And that's a recurring theme we'll find throughout this session. You'll see those quotes coming up from time to time. Now, in the live session, we also play a quick video at this point. We can't play the videos in the recordings, so we'll just reference it here because we're going to come back to that later on. It's a quick advert by Frank, the Drug Education Service, and this was created and broadcast in 2006, and it showed a mother trying to talk to her son about drugs. It doesn't go well to the extent that this actually happens and ends up with what would seem to be the SAS storming the house to try and stop the conversation from taking place. So we come back to that later, I just need to reference it there. It really highlights the difficulties and how awkward it is to have these conversations. And that takes us to the first part of the training session. That's the barriers that we experience in having a conversation. And there's two main barriers that we're aware of in particular when it comes to parents and parental figures. The first is people in that role feeling like they don't know what to say. I'm not sure how to discuss this topic. I don't know the topic well enough. And the other big issue might be actually thinking that when I do know what to say, my young people in my life don't tend to listen to me. And we've used the example here of a young person being asked to tidy their bedroom. They may be giving you lots of messages to say, actually, I'm not listening when you're trying to talk to me. But actually, that wouldn't really be the case when we look at research and what young people tell researchers when it comes to who do they value and who do they listen to and whose views do they actually seek out when they have problems. And often what we find is actually they do value the views of their parents, certainly about drugs. And we can find that in several places in research, which we'll come back to later on. I'll demonstrate that as we go through the session. In the meantime, what you might find is parents sometimes think, well, it's actually best to leave education to schools. And schools can teach about drugs so they can have the conversations. But when we talk to teachers about this topic, one of the best quotes we came across was this one, a teacher saying, well, actually, when it comes to drugs, the students seem to know more about this topic than I do. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that drug education is part of the curriculum now. It has been since September 2020. It's part of relationships, sex and health education curriculum. But even though it's part of the curriculum, the time devoted to teaching young people about drugs is pretty minimal. Now, there isn't actually going to say how long that should take, but it seems to be in many schools, certainly across North Yorkshire, maybe about an hour a year will be devoted to that topic. Sometimes it can be as little as 20 minutes. because schools have very busy curriculums, and sometimes this kind of topic might be condensed down to something discussed in form time before the school day really starts. Now, to demonstrate how small a portion of time that is, we've actually mocked up here the number of hours in a year and how a young person will spend those. Typically, they'll spend, for instance, about 7,500 hours at home and about 1,200 hours at school, of which 1 hour is in drug education. So it's a really small sliver of time, and it's a big question about how much we feel we can achieve within that hour. And it also makes us think, well, where are young people going to learn about drugs if they only get a very minimal amount of time learning about it at school? And that takes us to this report here, a report prepared for Ofcom. It's called Children's Media Lives 2024, and it tells us a lot about what young people are doing, mostly on their phones and going online. And actually, what this research tells us is that young people are really sophisticated going online with their phones. They're also quite naive, but mostly it's about them being able to connect with lots of different people in lots of different ways, and they're very clever about how they do that. They may not fully appreciate the content they're viewing at, but they do know how to use their phones and how to use all these different apps. Now, on average, a young person taking part in this research had about 9 apps on their phone, all geared towards connecting themselves with other people. For comparison, adults have about 6 apps on their phone for the same purpose. Young people also spend a lot of time on their phones. For the Grown Up in North Yorkshire survey, 43% of Year 10 said they spend 3 hours online or more after school each day. And that means they spend over 3 times longer online each day than in drug education for a whole year. And it's worth understanding a little bit about what they're viewing and how drug content then goes into their social media feeds. So their feed is based on things like their age, their gender, things they've clicked on previously, and other online friends. And actually, the social media platform will jumble lots of things together on this basis and feed them this over time. It's called passive learning. So they're not actively looking for drug content. They're not going onto Google most of the time and actually trying to find information this way. This information just finding its way to them. So for instance, we've got loads of screenshots here of the kind of content a young person might view as they scroll through on their phone. And just by chance, these two happen to be about drugs. And actually, there's a lot of content out there like that. So for instance, we can go to Instagram and we can put in the hashtag there, stoner memes, but you can also use lots of different online platforms to go and research this with different hashtags. And you'll find loads of different posts all about mostly cannabis, but other drugs as well. And this is the kind of content that we know gets fed to young people, and they do view it, which makes us worry about this. That because there's increasing number of drugs on social media and an increasing amount of content online about drugs, that we would see an increasing number of young people using drugs as a result, because we know that they view it. Actually, that isn't the case. The reality is demonstrated by this report here called DM for Details, and it was all about understanding how drugs are sold online and what this meant for young people who might view this happening online or be approached to buy drugs. And actually, overwhelmingly from this research, what we found is most people who see this online don't really care about it too much. There's a quote here of someone saying it's not particularly significant. I can't remember when I first saw it, just don't really care. It's like, oh, okay. And that's pretty typical of the other respondents taking part in this research. There was over 2,000 16 to 24-year-olds interviewed as part of this. 72% had seen drugs for sale online. Half of them didn't care. None said it would encourage them to take drugs, apart from a proportion, that's about a fifth of those, who had tried them already. They did say it might encourage me to take them again, but the vast majority did not feel like that. And that explains what we're seeing with drug use and drink use amongst young people over time. In both respects here, we see this falling over the last 20 to 25 years. So you can see that actually this is reducing over time. In particular with alcohol, you can see it's down to almost 37% now, so it's almost half of what it once was about in the late 90s. Now, 16 to 24-year-olds, they are more likely to be using drugs and drinking. But even so, the maximum it gets to is about 20% of this age group of young people say they've taken a drug in the last year. The really interesting thing here is in particular this, the numbers who are drinking. Actually 75%, although this figure has come down, it's still a really significant figure, that 75% of this age group of young people will say they've had a drink. And we have to think a little about how we perceive this risk. Now, this module today is about drugs, but actually alcohol is really significant as well, as you can see from this quote here. Here's Dom, age 17, just saying, well, I just wanted to try it, as in drinking, because basically he'd seen his parents drinking and he was like, well, I want to try that too. And that actually takes us to a different course we run if anyone would be interested in attending that, or you can watch the video that's available now. It's called Get and Drink. It's about how we understand alcohol and how consumers understand the risks of alcohol when they drink, or how this can impact their children. And actually, if you come and do that course, what you'll find is generally we do have limited awareness about that, and we don't fully appreciate what it might mean for young people around us when we're drinking and what messages that might convey. It's worth coming along to that if you're interested in learning more. In the meantime, we know that most young people do not use drugs. At most, the figure will reach 20%. 20% of young people will use drugs, and we have to question, well, why are they using drugs? And the answers, again, come from different studies. In this case, we're going to see the NHS study, National Study of Young People's Substance Use. And those young people taking part in that said actually mostly it's about seeing what it was like. It's about curiosity, as many things are in teenage years. I'm just trying to see things, see how I feel about them. And the only way to do that is to actually give it a go. Next, we have people feeling they want to get high or feel good. Then a group of young people who say, I just don't remember. Like I say, they can be quite passive in this and really unsure about why they've taken it, or, it might not be a big deal for them either way. We have a group of young people here who are using to forget their problems. It's actually not a big group, it's about 15%. But this would be really significant. If you have a young person who's using drugs to forget their problems, they're much more likely to get into difficulties, and we should have additional layers of concern around a young person in that group, and we should be thinking about how we support them around those problems. Again, we'll come back to this in the third part of this course. Then we have a number of people, 13% of young people are saying their friends were doing it. When we've tested this session with test audiences, we've had feedback from those audiences, mostly professionals who work with young people, said they expected that to be higher. They thought a lot more young people would be using drugs because their friends were doing it. And actually, that isn't necessarily the case, not in this research, and also not so much in that University of York research. And then finally, we had some young people saying, I just had nothing better to do. It was about boredom. We're going to come back to all this in part 3, like how do we help young people? And it might not surprise you to know that really we need to help them with their underlying issues as so much as trying to educate them about drugs, but that's something we'll come back to. In the meantime, again, we have our trigger warning here, and that's because we're about to start exploring the story of a young person who died having taken drugs. And this is the story about Dan Spargo-Mabs. It's his life that we're going to look at here. Now, Dan was really unfortunate. He was really unlucky in that he happened to take an ecstasy pill at the age of 16 that contained way too much MDMA and ultimately led to him dying sometime later in hospital. It's a really tragic story. It's told very eloquently in this book here by his mum, Fiona Spargo-Mabs. She also set up the DSM Foundation with her husband, and they're a really good drug education charity. Now, we've spoken to Fiona and her team in putting this session together, and she's happy for us to use Dan's image and tell his story here. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at when we were discussing Dan's story was the process he went through in the days leading up to that party, and his decision making around that in terms of how he ended up in a party and how he ended up taking a drug that ultimately and tragically would take his life. Now, Fiona explains this in loads of detail in her book, and it's a really good read. It's well worth buying it to read it and learn a lot about the lessons that can be taken from Dan's life. In the meantime, one of the things that she discusses in there is that after he died, the family were given his mobile phone back and were able to access this and look at his text messages from the day. And with her permission, we've actually got the text messages here that Dan was sending on the day and that he went to that party. And ultimately what it told us is that Dan probably didn't want to go to the party. He was telling this person on the other end of this text messaging conversation that he didn't really feel like he should go. He said he was tired. He said it would ruin George's party the next evening. He said he had to visit his grandpa in hospital. In the book, Fiona actually says his grandpa wasn't in hospital. And also he said he doesn't want to go if his friend doesn't go. And his friend is Alice. And Alice is really significant in this story because Alice is a really close friend of Dan's. In fact, Fiona says in the book that knowing that Alice was going with him to this party is one of the reasons that she agreed to him going, because Alice was basically the responsible one. She looked after him, and his dad, for instance, her dad was Freud, that would often bring him back home again from parties. So she was reassured by that. What she didn't realise at the time, and as she writes about in the book, was Alice and Dan had actually taken drugs together previously, and Alice had actually given him drugs previously. Now, Alice didn't give him the drugs on the night that he died. She didn't actually go to the party with him. And the thing that we want to take from that is that friendships and relationships for young people may be different to how we perceive them to be. So, for instance, we know that actually young people most likely will get their drugs, if they use drugs, from a friend. And that's really important for us to understand, because we might be thinking about drug dealers in this way: the very shady people that might linger around on street corners and are stereotyped and typecast as being really quite evil as drug pushers. And that might be what we're thinking about when we're thinking about drug dealers. But we know for young people, many of them won't have contact with anyone who remotely meets that description. And actually, if they use drugs, they get them from their friendship groups, or they get them from their online friends. And that's really significant, because you could be talking about two very different things. Again, from some of the research by Voltface, what they found was young people, when we were talking, when dealers are discussed with them, they don't picture their friends who might give them drugs as a dealer. They don't see this as dealing. They see them as their friends. So that is something to bear in mind if we're trying to have a conversation with a young person, that you do need to be trying to talk about the same thing, which on the surface superficially may be, but actually when you look at the detail, you aren't. And that's the same for dealers as it is for drugs in general. So typically we'll find parents, teachers, professionals will often have the mindset that drugs are really dangerous, and obviously they're dangerous. We've just discussed the case of a young person who died having taken drugs. But then young people have lots of experience of their friends using drugs, or may have this experience, and their friends all seem fine to them. And this can cause a real big disconnect between the parent or the parental figure and the young person, because again, the adult in this case is talking about this really high risk activity, and the young person is not relating to that in any way, because their real life experience is so different. And to that extent, it's worth bearing in mind that the things you've been told about drugs might not equip you for having the conversation that you'd like to have with a young person. And so it's worth quickly running through the kinds of things you may have heard about drugs. So particularly if you grew up in the 80s, you may have been exposed to this drug education campaign here. It's called Heroin Screws You Up. It was aimed at school children in England and Wales in the 1980s, about 1984, 1985, I think it was. And it really portrayed drug use as being particularly evil in this respect, heroin. The idea being that if you use heroin, it will screw your life up. So that's the kind of childhood education you may have had. Then, in the present day, wherever there's drugs come up on soap operas or TV dramas, we will inevitably find that the storyline is about addiction or potentially about overdose. In the case of Holly Barton, Emmerdale, for instance, she died from an overdose in that series. And that tells us the messaging that almost 100% of the time someone is using drugs, that a bad thing, the worst thing, is likely to happen, which will again make us fear the worst if a young person in our life might try drugs. And then we look at present day reporting in the media. Often this is quite extreme, talking about zombie drugs, Frankenstein drugs, with the most extreme examples and imagery attached to it. Again, making us really panic about how seriously harmful drugs can be. Now, this has been tried before in terms of drug education. At this point in the full session, we do play the recording of the advert called This Is Your Brain on Drugs. In its place here, we've got a little poster from the time. Now, this was from 1987. The reason we put it in the training, and I should say this was broadcast widely in America. It wasn't a British advert, but it has become something widely shared online in the modern world. But the reason we put it in the training is to demonstrate how oversimplified the education is sometimes about drugs, and how the messaging around drugs can be too simplistic for us, for it to be meaningful or helpful in connecting with young people. So for instance, if you try and have a conversation with a young person, which basically in essence is telling them that drugs fry their brain, you'll find it doesn't answer any of their questions whatsoever. So young people do have questions. They ask whether drugs, how harmful drugs are, whether they're all the same. They have lots of questions about their friends taking drugs, or adults in their life taking drugs, or about a parent potentially ever having taken drugs. They want to know why medications are different to drugs, and a really common question is why cannabis is illegal but alcohol isn't. So you could find yourself bombarded with all these questions for which that past education and those TV commercials don't really equip us at all to support the young person. Now, interestingly, we do have a session available to go and learn more about messaging around drugs and some of the facts and some of the figures around drugs that can help us better understand what we're actually trying to talk about. It's called Drugs Think Different. Again, it's on Drink Drug Hub. There's a recording available on the YouTube channel, but it's also available for a live session. If you attend that, it's an hour long, and what you'll find is that drugs aren't safe, but for most people, they're not nearly as dangerous as we've been led to believe, or dangerous in the ways that we've been told. So if you'd like to go and book that, that's a really good session to explore, or a good recording to go and view. In the meantime, for this session, we're going to condense it down just to some key learning. So for instance, we've got Sheila Vaccaro here. She's a harm reduction researcher and author, and in her recent book, Harm Reduction Gap, she talks about her own drug education. So she says that actually as she got older, she realised the sky did not fall in when her friends and peers started using drugs. They didn't get instantly addicted, and after simple experiment with drug use alone, it didn't somehow change their character or personality. In other words, the things she had been told as a child never came true when she actually experienced her peers using drugs. And that told her drug education ultimately wasn't really useful for equipping her for the real world. We find something similar with Maya Salvitz, again, in this case a neuroscience journalist who writes extensively about addiction. And she tells us actually expert consensus that serious addiction only affects a minority of those who try in the most highly addictive drugs, which again is quite different to what we've been told about drugs. And then we can get this paper here, which has been written or co-authored by a whole team of really a whole team of experts, leading lights in the field of addiction and recovery, and in particular drug use in young people. And what they said is their findings suggest that the majority of young people don't use drugs, which we know is true. We've just seen that a second ago. And those of them that do use drugs use them in an infrequent and time-limited manner and face a low risk of individual harm. In other words, they will not use them very frequently, and when they do use them, it's really unlikely they're going to suffer significant or serious harm as a result. We could say it's low risk, but then we've got a bit of a problem on our hands, because we're talking about low risk, but we're also talking about an activity that does cause the deaths of young people every year within the UK. We've already looked at Dan Spargo-Mabs and the tragic circumstances in which he lost his life, and here are images and names of other young people who we cover in other sessions of this series, specifically Drugs Think Different. So we have to think about how we're talking about low risk and at the same time talking about something that can cost a young person their life. And we hope we can explain this a little bit with this book here. It's not really about how we perceive drugs, it's about how we perceive risk. So this is a book called Risk, written by Dan Gardner some years ago now, but explains how we perceive and understand risk and how we respond to it. Specifically, we've got the example here of people waiting in a GP surgery, and actually they're sitting there suffering from symptoms or illnesses such as diabetes, COPD, heart disease and cancer. Now those are all within the top 10 illnesses that cause deaths globally. We've also got accidents here, because specifically for young people, that's a really significant risk factor. So these should be the things that we'd be most worried about. Any day of the week, these should be the things we're most worried about. But say you're sitting in the GP surgery and a crocodile comes along and eats this man, and then the receptionist says, well, that almost never happens. Even though it almost never happens, I can guarantee the thing you're most worrying about now will be crocodiles. And that's because this book tells us that something doesn't happen very often for us to worry about it a great deal. If it's presented to us in a very scary way, we'll often overestimate its likelihood of happening, which means that when we're talking to a young person, if they're using drugs, because we've heard that a young person has died from drugs, we will have that anxiety and think this is much more likely to happen to our young person than the reality actually is. We call this the crocodile effect in the training session. And the significance of this is it can make us panic, and that can fill our conversation with that anxiety. And what that can mean for the young person is their experience of the conversation can be one full of fear. And that's really significant. because what we'll find out in this session today is their experience of the conversation is really critical as to whether they absorb information and take on board any advice and actually feel like they can be open about things and talk to the adult who is talking to them. We know that if we can manage our anxiety, then we can have calmer conversations, and this is really productive in terms of trying to support young people. There's some other things to bear in mind here as well. So we know that children can really fear potential overreactions from parents and professionals. So first of all, there's that wave of potential anger or anxiety that may come across from the parent or professional, but then there's the consequences that may go with that. So they worry about things like being grounded or removal of freedoms. They might worry about unconsented sharing of information, particularly if they're talking to a professional. And again, potentially becoming embroiled in safeguarding processes. One of the big things is that when you don't know about their drug use, and only they do, they control the narrative. But as soon as they talk to you as an adult, they lose that control. And that's really significant because they will be really mindful about what might happen once they've lost control. So for instance, we have a quote here from a young person taking part in that research that we've talked about. And this is a young person who informed her teacher that she'd been using drugs. And then this escalated very quickly for her in a really negative way. So she said this is why she doesn't trust teachers anymore, because basically she had tried telling them something, and that's significant. What we'll find as we go on with this research is that young people do want to talk to adults about drugs, and this is the case here. The young person had chosen to open up about their drug use, and they'd chosen to open up to a teacher. And in doing so, the young person asked the teacher not to tell her mum because she knew it would hurt her. Now, the issue with this, if we read down on the quote, is that the teacher did tell her mum. And then a lot of unexpected consequences happened as a result. So the mum actually left the family home, and the young person very much felt that the teachers had a role to play in this, and actually says the teacher had said that she was a bad person for using drugs. And then this really became a sequence of events that had real harm for her and potentially also for her mum. So her lesson from this, Carla's lesson from this, is that she shouldn't talk to adults any longer about her drug use, in particular teachers. And this is one of those examples of those consequences quickly, rapidly escalating in a way that the young person isn't in control of, and anticipating that can stop them from talking. So we would think children and young people don't trust adults to talk about drugs as a result. We would think that we would be the last people they'd want to turn to. But actually, although those barriers are real and those anxieties are real, this isn't the case. We know that young people do trust parents in particular and professionals when it comes to discussing drugs. Now, first clue that we had, or I had, that this was the case was when I visited Selby College some years ago to talk to 4 classes. I was talking to A-level students, sports students, public services students and engineering students aged between 16 and 18. And Selby College have been really kind and given me permission to talk to these young people about drugs and to ask them particular questions. Now, these were on anonymous surveys. They could answer them however they wanted to. I couldn't even tell you if I wanted to who the young people were. What was interesting was the questions and their responses. So in particular, we asked them, who do you trust most to talk to about drugs? And they had a series of options to tick from this. Now, from this, all 4 groups fed back the same. Parents and guardians came out consistently as the highest group in terms of these would be the people that I would talk to about drugs. I trust them most. Next would be tutors, and then it would be siblings. Now, friends and friends of friends did not rank very highly here. And actually, we also had the internet on here, which didn't, like search engines, which didn't really figure highly either in terms of seeking support. By far and away, it was parents and then tutors who they felt they could turn to. Now, you might say this is a small sample. There's about 50 students in total, and I'd agree with you. You wouldn't take that as being necessarily representative of all young people ever. In fact, you wouldn't. But it was the first clue that something here wasn't as we quite expected when we set off to do that research. And what we find is their response there is very consistent with other research as we've done further studying and putting this session together. So, for instance, in the Grown Up in North Yorkshire survey, 57% of people said if they wanted more information about things they were worried about, they would speak with their parents or carers. Again, these would be the first people they would turn to. The NHS England surveys also report similar findings, and that's quoted in several places. We've used Owen Bowden-Jones's work and Fiona Spargo-Mabb's work here, who referenced that work. So we know consistently young people do seem to feel like their parents are trusted and should be trusted, and they would like to talk to them. And actually tutors here come out very highly as well. So we have to think, well, why don't they talk to their parents and tutors? What does prevent them from doing that? We've touched on this a little bit already, but ultimately there's three things for us to think about as we conclude this part of the course. The first part is difficulty in starting the conversation. Does a young person know how to ask about drugs or how to start that conversation? The second thing is they worry about what happens afterwards, as we've already discussed. They worry about getting into trouble. And the third thing is them having confidence that you are the right person to help. In other words, that you know drugs well enough to be able to actually give them information, advice and support that they need. Like we said, we looked at the beginning, the barriers to parents and adults having these conversations, and frequently the response is actually, I don't know this topic very well. I don't feel confident discussing it. And for that reason, we've got the second part of the session here, which is all about drugs used by young people and the risks associated with them. Now we know there's hundreds of different drugs available of all different types and varieties, so we could get into quite a lot of detail here about the different substances available. But actually, what we're going to use is the smoking, drink and drug use among young people research published by NHS England, in this case from 2023. And that's actually really clear in terms of the drugs that they look at. And we're going to follow their guidance here in explaining those drugs to you. So below the age of 11, this research tells us that drug use is rare. About 4% of under 11-year-olds have tried drugs, and mostly these are volatile substances. And by those volatile substances, we're talking about household products, things like hairspray, body spray, lighter fluid, butane gas, petrol, things that the young person may find lying around the house that they can open and have a sniff and put back again, maybe without anyone knowing that they've done that. It can give them a bit of a rush. It doesn't last very long and generally doesn't carry a high level of risk, although it isn't risk-free. So you can damage your nose, mouth or soft tissues through this use. It can be addictive, and that's because it only lasts a very short length of time, which encourages you to repeat it. And it is possible to die through sudden sniffing death syndrome or asphyxiation, particularly if a young person is, for instance, putting the gas into a bag over their face and then they pass out and can't breathe. So there is guidance about how to try and stay safe if you are using these substances, but overall the risk is not hugely high. If you do want to know more information about that risk, we'd advise going to look at the work of Resolve. But certainly at very young age, this is the most likely substance that a young person will use. Not always, but is most likely. Now, from the age of 12 upwards, the drug pattern actually changes quite significantly and remains pretty stable from there. So drug use does gradually increase from the age of 12 up to a peak of 20% of 15-year-olds having tried an illegal drug. And the kind of drugs they're trying looks like this. 75% of the time it will be cannabis, which they can ingest, either smoke as a weed, as a joint, or as a spliff. They can also chew gummies, which they can buy online, often branded as sweets, or they can use a vape oil. These will be the most common ways a young person may experience cannabis. 25% of the time they're using different drugs, which we'll come back to. In the meantime, if you don't know a great deal about anything when it comes to drugs, just learning about cannabis will give you the information you need in most cases for most young people who may be using drugs. So cannabis comes in two parts. We've got part of the cannabis which is CBD and part of it which is THC. These are the two main compounds that you'll find in cannabis. The main difference is CBD is legal. It's not believed to be particularly harmful. It is believed to have some benefits, and that's why you can buy CBD products. THC, by contrast, is the part of cannabis that gets you high. It's psychoactive and it isn't legal, and it is associated with some levels of harm. As a general rule to think about here is that THC in cannabis is a little like alcohol in a drink. The higher percentage of THC there is, the greater the effect and the more potential for harm. So that's a really quite simple way to think about how THC works within cannabis. It's also worth bearing in mind that THC within cannabis has increased over years. So traditional herbal cannabis, was the sort of thing you might have been using before the 1990s, was about 3 to 4% THC in content. whereas now today's street cannabis is more like 10% and over, which is often what we would call skunk. Skunk just means a very strong cannabis product, which means high in THC. Now, we shouldn't worry too much about THC in terms of immediate risk. If you have too much THC, the most likely thing to happen is you'll feel like this person on the screen here. You'll feel dizzy, you'll go pale, you have a high heart rate, potentially start vomiting and have clammy skin. We call this a whitey. Now, thankfully, nobody's ever known to have fatally overdosed on THC. In fact, a fatal overdose of THC would be about 1,000 times the average dose. However, you can become addicted, and this is more likely if you start using cannabis as a teenager. It can also contribute to mental health problems, particularly for those with genetic vulnerability to those issues, by which we mean people with a family history of mental health issues. And finally, it might have a negative effect on brain development in young people. And by young people, I mean anyone below the age of 25, but increasingly this is applicable to those using as teenagers and under the age of 15. We would be particularly worried in that case in terms of what this might mean for your brain development and learning how to do things like regulate your emotions. Now, although the risk isn't immediate in terms of someone could potentially overdose and die from cannabis, we should bear in mind that there are significant risks here, and cannabis is the most common drug young people seek help for. Now, as to what to say to young people about cannabis, David Nutt here has some advice. He has a book here about cannabis in which he talks about talking to your teen, and he says that these are the things to bear in mind. He says actually if you are talking to your teenager, advising that later in life you start using, it's the less likely you are to be harmed. If you're using cannabis, don't do it every day. That's how dependence can start. Try and avoid high THC cannabis, but he doesn't explain how you can avoid high THC cannabis, given that actually most cannabis available in the illegal market is high THC. He says avoid using spice, which we're going to come to in a second. If you smoke cannabis, ideally do it without tobacco. That's because tobacco itself comes with its own level of harms. Don't smoke and drive or do anything after smoking for which you need a clear head. I would add to that, be really mindful about whether other people are in smoking and whether they're going to drive if you're getting in their car, and ideally then don't get in their car. And finally, monitor how cannabis affects you to learn when you've had enough. So that's really brief run through cannabis. In the meantime, we'll take a look at some of these other drugs that young people may use. We've got 4 categories here outlined by the NHS England report. We've got volatile substances, nitrous oxide, new psychoactive substances, and Class A drugs. Now the first 2 we can put together. Volatile substances, which we've already looked at, those are your household products that young people may be using. They also include nitrous oxide, which are those kind of canisters you may see listed on the floor. Young people fill up balloons with these canisters full of nitrous oxide and then inhale the gas, and it gives them a really brief rush. That also is a volatile substance and comes with many of the same risks that we've already looked at on that slide. Next, new psychoactive substances are also known colloquially as spice, and spice has been in the news a lot recently for finding its way into vapes that young people use, and those young people then potentially collapsing at school and having to be rushed to hospital. And there's a lot of worry about young people vaping spice, often unknowingly. But we don't always explain what spice is. So in this session, we're going to try and explain it in really simple terms that makes it really clear. So for instance, the best thing to start with here is to look at cannabis and make the comparison here to cannabis. Now, cannabis is a drug that you would have to grow as a plant to begin with. So you need a field, you need or a house setting where you can grow your plants indoors, as many times it is in the UK, and you grow and harvest your crop and then create the drug from that. Now, spice isn't like that. Spice is not something you will grow from a crop. It's something that you will create within a chemical lab. It's actually a fake product designed to mimic the effect of cannabis, or at least that was its origin. And what you're looking at here are the headquarters of a firm that actually creates products like this. It was described in a book by a journalist called Ben Westhoff. He actually visited these headquarters to have a look at how they make these drugs. And spice ultimately predominantly is created by Chinese labs and transported into the UK illegally. So one way to think about it is it's a kind of Chinese knockoff product of cannabis. That was the original intent around spice. It has developed since then. We'll take you on that journey in a second. But for now, the best way to think about it is it's an imitation product. It's cheaper than cannabis, it's less predictable, and it is more harmful, as we'll see. So its origin story was as a synthetic version of cannabis, and it was legitimately developed by a pharmaceutical firm. The scientist who developed it was John W. Huffman, and he was looking to create a synthetic cannabis that the pharmaceutical firm could then sell legitimately. As it was, they didn't develop the product, but the research he completed was made available, because that's how scientists work. They publish their papers, and other scientists can try and replicate the findings. What John Huffman found was that other scientists then replicated his work, but then modified it. And these weren't always scientists with the best of intentions. They were now developing this for the black market. So for instance, this spice drug is 100 to 800 times as potent as THC. This one has been found in vapes in Oldham, and I believe has also been found in vapes in North Yorkshire now. And this one as well has been found within the recreational setting within the UK, and has led to 3 UK deaths between January 19 to August 20. And that's one of the key distinctions to make here. Whereas THC isn't thought to lead to fatal overdoses, spice we know for a fact has done. And the worry is that this imitation drug, there are hundreds of drugs out there, all that it would be labelled spice. They all fall under this umbrella, and they're changing all the time. We're not sure which new ones are coming into the market. Well, what can happen is dealers can get hold of these drugs quite cheaply. They can import them quite easily, and they can use them to increase the potency of the drugs that they sell. So they'll either spray them onto cannabis, or they can add them to vape oils. And that means the consumer of these products might unknowingly ingest spice, thinking they're using cannabis or a THC oil, when actually they're ingesting another drug entirely, a much more potent and unpredictable drug. So there are significant risks with spice. You could have seizures. There's often fear and anxiety, even if you haven't got spice in your vape, to think there might be spice there. And it has occasionally caused deaths. 165 deaths are known about between 2012 to 2019. We've yet to find any cases of young people dying this way. Predominantly these deaths consist of people within the homeless population, within prison settings. That's often where spice is used. But there is potential there, and there's no reason, there isn't a safeguard here to say that young people won't be harmed in this way. We know that young people have been and are exposed to this drug. So young people do need to be aware of that if they're using a vape oil, which predominantly they're trying to use to ingest THC. If they're doing that, there is a chance that they may ingest spice by mistake. So that's really quickly what the media coverage is about spice and what the worry is there. That leaves us with this final category of drugs, our Class A drugs. These are the most potent and harmful drugs under the eyes of the law, and they would be the ones that generally would be most worried about, particularly when it comes to addiction. Now, you can get addicted to the other substances on this page that you can see, but these would be the most powerful drugs, so they would carry the highest risk attached to them. Now, when it comes to addiction, so young people are using, and we know young people are increasingly using cocaine, and ketamine is also increasingly common. When it comes to addiction, we can predict this risk. So in other words, we can look at a group of young people and we can predict which of those young people are more likely to suffer addiction when they're using these drugs. And those young people are more likely to have a family history of addiction. They're more likely to have impulsive personality types, where they don't necessarily think through the consequences fully about their actions and what it might mean long term, or if they do think it through, they're not particularly worried about that. They're more likely to be really impulsive in their decision making. They may also have more anxious personality types, where they are thinking through lots of those consequences, but it's creating a lot of anxiety for them for which drugs may help them resolve that. We know young people with past trauma are more likely to suffer with addictions or with mental health concerns. And anyone who starts drug use at a particularly early age, so below the age of 15 is an example here, would be at higher risk of developing an addiction, regardless of the drugs they're using. But obviously, the more potent the drug, the higher the risk. And then finally, some young people may be targeted for county lines. Now, before we move on to that, it's worth pointing out that this is not a universal equal risk for all young people. Every young person, indeed every adult, carries different risk factors with them. So part of this is not so much about understanding the drugs, although obviously that's what we're trying to do here, but also about understanding the specific young person and their risk factors and helping them understand that for themselves. In the meantime, we've underlined county lines because it is worth brushing onto that topic. There is much more detailed and in-depth training about county lines available for people who are interested in that, not through Drink Drug Hub, but through other providers. And if you drop us a line, we'll put you in touch with them. But if you just want a bit of information, we'd recommend going to North Yorkshire's Safeguarding Children Partnership page, which has a really good definition about county lines. It's basically a violent and exploitative form of drug distribution. It's where drug gangs target vulnerable children to indoctrinate them into gang culture and use them for transporting, smuggling, selling drugs, collecting money, and being part of the organised crime group. There's a really good explanation on that website, but there's also some really good videos here. There's a good series, a good playlist called Alfie's Story available on YouTube. It's worth checking that out if you're interested in learning more about county lines and what that looks like in action. In that case, we have Alfie, who's the main star of that playlist, and it's about his story. Now, how he presents, and this may be familiar with anyone who works with young people, particularly within school settings or youth groups, or as social workers, might find that a young person is missing school, engaging in antisocial behaviour, or using drugs. Now, that might be what we see, and we might have to respond to that. But what we might not be so aware about is this other character. And that's where this series of videos are really good, because it introduces us to this person. This is the gang member who's ultimately exploiting Alfie. And we go on that journey as part of those videos about what that looks like in practice. But the main point we're making in this session is that this part of the story might not be visible. You might just be aware of the child and how they're acting and what that means in terms of how you respond to that. And that's worth pointing out here in terms of something we're seeing in the UK at the moment. There is a growth in exclusions and suspensions from schools, even though drug use within young people is declining. We would point out at this point that you need to be very careful with these responses with young people. We know that removing a child from school also removes them from sources of protection. And it could be deliberately engineered by those looking to exploit them. In other words, the young person is being manipulated to miss school, to truant, to engage in behaviours more likely to get them excluded, because getting them excluded then makes them more available to the gang to exploit. Now, if you're working with a young person, or you have a young person in your life where you worry about this and you're not sure if this is happening again, there's lots of great guidance from the North Yorkshire Safeguarding Children Partnership. They have pages here looking at the things to look out for in terms of behaviours, relationships, their appearance, and the possessions they might have. And if you do have worries, you can refer here through their website, and we can provide, for anyone who's interested, we provide this for anyone attending our sessions, and if you would like this, email us and we'll email it to you, a useful links handout for parents or professionals with links to this page so that you can go and get that support. In the meantime, what we're trying to point out here is that drug use is different for different young people, and it doesn't always carry the same level of risk, as indeed young people don't always carry the same level of risk. Now, most drug use for most young people, as we've looked at already, will be occasional use. So for instance, they will use monthly, typically with friends at parties. That's a very different sort of use to the use you might see where a young person is using alone or using often, such as daily. I'd recommend these would be two big things to look out for if you're discussing drug use with a young person in terms of how often they're using. I would say if they're using alone or using often, this would be a red flag in both occasions. And that's because this style of use is likely to create dependency. It's likely to become a coping mechanism, and actually the more often they're using the drug, the less effective it is, so the more likely they're to use it. And finally, if they're having to isolate themselves in order to use their drugs or obtain their drugs, then this means they're more likely to miss out on making friendships and taking opportunities in their life that would otherwise enable them to move on with their lives. And actually they can get stuck at this phase and get isolated, and it can really become quite a long-term challenge for them. But that isn't to say this other style of drug use is risk-free. And that's because of this. About the conditions in which drugs are made and the very nature of the illegal market and the products that it produces. What you're looking at here is an image of a drugs lab in Australia. Now, this one was manufacturing ecstasy pills. We just happened to use this one because it was a good quality photo for us to use. But it goes to demonstrate the kind of conditions in which drugs are manufactured. And this tells us why drugs can be really unpredictable in what they do when they take them. It's an unregulated market, which means there isn't anyone overseeing how drugs are produced or what the quality is that's being made available to consumers. When you buy any illegal drug, you don't know who's made it, you don't know how it's made, you're not sure what it contains, and you can't be certain what happens when you consume it. And a really important point to make here is this is a universal risk to anyone using any illegal substance. A good way to think about it is this. We call it the chocolate chip cookie theory. It explains what the risk is with particular drugs when you take them. In this case, we're looking at ecstasy, but it would apply to other drugs just as equally. So if you think about making chocolate chip cookies, you'll have your cookie dough mixture, and into that you'll mix your chocolate chips, and these won't be evenly distributed. Some cookies will be made with lots of chocolate chips in, some with many less. And this is a good representation of what happens when people are making pills and powders for the illegal market. When you're buying a pill or powder, it's not entirely just the drug. It's actually made of a blend of different substances. In this case, we're looking at ecstasy pills, so we will have MDMA powder in there because that's the drug in ecstasy that makes you high. But there'll also be binding agents and colorants and other substances to try and create the pill itself. Now, when people are making these tablets, what they'll do is put the MDMA powder in, mix it around, but it's not necessarily mixed evenly. So some of the pills will actually have really a high level of MDMA, some will have none in whatsoever. That's why you shouldn't judge your safety on how a drug affects others. Just because they've taken a pill doesn't mean your pill's identical to theirs. See, the advice is go low and slow, which we're going to come back to in a second. Now, in the meantime, it's worth bearing in mind that this is really topical and relevant for the story of Dan. Dan took ecstasy with his friends, and they each put in £20 to buy the drugs together. His pill just happened to turn out to have a lethal dose compared to the other pills. It could just have easily been one of his friends. Now, the MDMA in his blood was 12 times the level of that had caused fatalities previously, so that pill was always going to prove to be a fatal dose for whoever happened to take it, and it was just a real tragic turn of events that meant Dan was the one who took that. And that's why we have this advice here, go low and slow. This is what we call harm reduction. It's advice for not just young people, but anyone who's going to use a drug and has made the decision to use the drug, that helps keep them safe. It cannot guarantee safety, but it can guarantee it will reduce the risk. Obviously, the safest thing is to avoid the drug altogether, but this is bearing in mind young people will still choose to take drugs, and there needs to be guidance and support for them if they decide to do that. So the first point here, and we've taken this from the DSM Foundation website, again, it's a really good tool for resources, but the first point that they make is that you should know your stuff about what it is you're taking. We've actually got a video on Drink Drug Hub that you can see trailed here by Global Drug Survey. They created a 4-minute video about how to take a drug for the first time, aimed at young people, because they had completed a survey in which 20% of young people said they'd taken a mystery white powder in the last 12 months. They didn't know what it was, but they still took it. We would obviously say that's a really bad idea. You should definitely know what it is you're taking and what you're expecting when you take it. And there's a lot of good information out there. We've referenced most of it, as much as we can find, on Drink Drug Hub for anyone looking for accurate information to better understand the drug they may be taking. Also, people should stay together, and that's because friends can look out for each other. We do have cases of people who have really tragically overdosed and then died because people didn't know that they had overdosed and they hadn't been found. If you're with your friends can look after you and get help. Don't mix your drugs. We know that people do. We know that people do because they're trying to heighten the effect of the drugs, or they're trying to prolong the effect. But if you do that, it will have unpredictable consequences and often unintended consequences. So wherever you can, don't mix the drugs. If you do mix the drugs, then lower the amount considerably. Being in a good space is important. That's because we know people are much more likely to make mistakes around their drug use if they are particularly elated or if they're particularly depressed. Either of these mental states are a bad space to be in if you're going to take drugs. And finally, have an escape plan. Now, when we're saying an escape plan, what we're talking about here is a young person may not know how to leave a tricky situation. They may be for instance, at a party and feel uncomfortable and want to leave, but they don't know how to say this to their friends, or they don't want to leave alone and they're really feeling a bit stuck. Now, An escape plan can be the thing that they've prepared in advance that helps them get out of that situation. Here's an example of one in practice, and this was an example given to us by Fiona, Dan's mum. She said that she'd come across a parent who had got an agreement with his daughter where if she was ever stuck, she could text him just the letter X and he would immediately phone her. Now, the phone call and the content of the phone call itself wasn't particularly important. What was important was that her friends could see that she'd received a call, and she could basically say that, well, my dad's phoned me and I've got to go home. And it gave her a way of leaving without being challenged about or being talked into staying. Because if your dad's told you have to go, the young person can say, well, I've got to, and that's just, I've got to go now. So this was something prepared in advance to enable a young person to leave a situation in which they might be uncomfortable. And while we're talking about escape plans, it's also briefly worth looking at emergency plans. This is about having conversations with young people to be prepared in the event, or the unlikely event, that the worst happens, but the worst can happen, so thinking about being prepared is a good idea. So this is about making sure a young person understands the signs of an overdose, or how to respond to an overdose. For instance, putting someone in a recovery position, this may not be information that they need for themselves, because they may say, I'm not going to use drugs, but you can still say it's worth knowing about because someone there may do, and you may need to help them. They may also need help in terms of being confident in calling 999 and knowing that they won't get into trouble for ringing that number to seek help for someone in distress. And in doing that, also making sure their phone is charged before they go. And if possible, a parent would really benefit from contact details with another friend if needed. So for whatever reason, they can't contact their young person on the phone, that they can contact them through another means. Now, we do actually have a lot more training on this topic in our overdose awareness session, and we just put this in our sessions to prompt people so you're aware that it's there if you're interested. The video will also be available to view, all about overdose awareness, how overdoses happen, and how to try and stay safe. In the meantime, it's worth bearing this in mind, that this traditional perception of risk that we've been given, which is overly simplistic, isn't really helpful in explaining risk and isn't helpful in educating young people. What we're really looking at is dynamic risk. So dynamic risk looks like this, that there are different factors to think about when it comes to explaining what the risk is to a young person. Specifically, we're thinking about three. The first two we've discussed already. There's the risk of the drug and knowing what's in it. And then there's the risk of yourself as an individual. That's how you're using the drug and why you're using the drug. So your family history, your personality type, the things that you're looking for in taking drugs, what that means in terms of how you're likely to consume the drug. You may be more likely to use it in a really impulsive way, which obviously would be riskier than someone using it in a very planned, methodical way, where they've done the research in advance. And then finally, we've got this risk demonstrated here by these circumstances. Again, we're looking at a very upsetting image of young people who have died. Now, they've all died having taken drugs, but it wasn't necessarily the drugs that caused their death, rather the drugs contributed. And that's because they died having, in the case of the young person at the top, went for a swim in a lake. Matthew at the bottom fell in a canal, and Louise drowned in a bath. They were all in situations that weren't safe, having taken a drug. And this we would call our situational risk. That's where we are and when we choose to take a drug. Now, again, we would say the safest thing is to avoid drugs altogether, but we have to be mindful young people do choose to take drugs, and when they do need this education to understand how to try and stay safe. Now, that takes us to this third part about how do we actually communicate that to young people in a way that makes a difference, that they can change their behaviour and decision making to stay safe, or perhaps to abstain from drugs completely. Now, whether we can convince young people to abstain from drugs completely has been something of an obsession for adults for quite a few years now. And what we've really needed in this is this sort of machine here. This machine's really clever. It can take really complex ideas and like training sessions like this, and you basically funnel them all in one end of the machine. It will spit out little slogans, little leaflets, little snapshots of information that in theory can change behaviours. And we know that this does work with other issues. So for instance, this has been used for things like helping young people cross roads, helping people wear seatbelts, the clunk click every trip slogan, helping us understand how to eat fruit and veg. There's the slogan, at least 5 a day. and quite dramatically helping people reduce or quit smoking. That slogan there, or that saying of smoking kills, for that and many other reasons, has really helped reduce rates of smoking. So this can be effective. Now the problem is with drugs, when we've tried something similar to drugs, the slogan we came up with was this one: just say no. Theoretically, it hits all the marks. It's only 3 words long, it's very memorable, and it's really clear on what it's instructing people to do. So in theory, this should be successful, and we gave it a really good go to try and get young people to follow this lead. Now, to give a bit of history here, it's worth understanding the history to understand where we're at today. The Just Say No campaign was really much forefronted by Nancy Reagan in America, the First Lady at the time. She didn't invent the slogan, but she had a big say in promoting it. And she roped in loads of celebrities to help with this. People like David Hasselhoff and Clint Eastwood. There were loads of others. We couldn't put them all up on the slide here. And we even had Mr. T. Now, in the full training session, the live session, we'll play you this advert that's on the screen here, in which Mr. T basically shouts at young people to tell them to stop taking drugs. Now, this was in America, but this campaign also came to Britain. Our celebrities weren't quite of the same caliber. They had Clint Eastwood and we had Esther Rantzen. We also had Nick Ross, but we did have a Just Say No campaign. Most memorably, it featured in the soap Grange Hill, targeted at young people, in which one of the characters, Sam Maguire, became addicted to heroin. And he, or the actor behind that, then fronted the campaign of Just Say No. There was all sorts of things going on in the 80s in this respect. There was, as you can see on the right here, a song from the Grange Hill cast, which got to number 5 in the charts, called Just Say No. It also appeared in various TV programs, and at the bottom here there were some different programs entirely, still with the message about avoiding drugs. These were drug education programs for school children. And speaking of school children, not only was there campaigns and TV programs about this, there was really clear education aimed at them as well. So we've talked about the Heroin Screws You Up campaign. This was this consisted of 2 short TV films, magazine adverts, a poster, leaflets for parents, and it was created by a professional ad firm. It cost £2 million to produce and to distribute, and it went very heavily into shock tactics, showing people or young people the worst possible consequences of heroin use and trying to prevent them from using as a consequence. Now in Scotland they took a slightly different approach. They wanted to inform young people rather than scare them. So they were taking a choice-based approach called You've Got the Choice. That turned into Choose Life Not Drugs, which we may have heard about from the Trainspotting film and also from the hit song as a result. But it became quite a big cultural slogan. So these were 2 quite different approaches, but they were really widespread and they were blanketed across different populations of young people to try and change their decision making around drugs. Now, whether it worked is something we can see in the data from the time in terms of how many young people had tried illegal drugs. So bearing in mind this was really heavily promoted in the 1980s, what you can see is it failed to have any impact. In fact, the increase in young people using drugs was more marked afterwards than it was before. So it really didn't have the effect intended. Young people have been surveyed after these campaigns, in particular the Heroin Screws You Up campaign, and what they found was they dismissed it largely because basically the message wasn't consistent with their own life experiences. But all was not lost, because we also had school-based interventions. These are classes young people were made to attend in which they could learn all about drugs and all about the risks and hopefully educate them to avoid them. Now, there hasn't just been like one school-based intervention, there's been hundreds of them. Here's just a list of some of the ones that we're aware of. These weren't just within the UK, in fact, most of these were in the US. You can see a big list here of different programs that have been attempted, and the years in brackets you can see are years in which research was published about those programs. So they have been researched heavily to try and understand what works, why does it work, how do we repeat success so young people can learn about drugs and hopefully avoid them. However, what researchers consistently say is that although they've researched this an awful lot, particularly since 1980, it's not really generated the amount of information they need to know what actually works. And that's for lots of different reasons. The programs are very different, they're developed differently, they're delivered differently, there's not the consistency that's needed for robust research. Even so, the leading researcher in this field for many years was Nancy Tobler. She's credited with completing the first large-scale reviews of these prevention programs in 86, 97 and 2000. And she actually came up with a list saying these are the things that generally typify the programs that work better. They tend to be participatory. That means the young people all take part. They don't just sit there and receive information. They contribute, they talk, and this is best done in small groups. It's good if they have structured activities, they can interact with each other, if they rehearse drug refusal skills, and if they do role plays. They need to be able to practice these things. They need to be able to model behaviours, and also supportive comments from the group can be really helpful. So these be the kind of things that were more likely to work within school settings. We also know about what doesn't work. And we've got 4 things to look at here. Firstly, we know scare tactics don't work. These have been used extensively without success, even though they remain popular, and we know they're still used today. There isn't any evidence to say they really work effectively in preventing young people from using drugs. Surprisingly, information doesn't seem to help either in terms of preventing young people from using drugs. So just giving them information about drugs does help improve their recall about this information. They can tell you more accurate things about drugs afterwards, but it doesn't seem to affect their decision making. We also know large class sizes aren't helpful. So lectures or teacher-led only classes, passive participation, any situation in which the young people are just sitting there and information is being fed to them, but they're not actually participating, isn't believed to be very effective in terms of changing drug taking behaviour. And finally, framing drug use as a simple decision. Now, when we're talking about this is going to take us to the DARE programme. Now, although there's been hundreds of different programmes around, there's one that stands above all else in terms of its prominence, in terms of how much money was invested in it and how many young people attended it. And this is DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. It was launched in 1989 in America. In the original format, it ran to 2003. It is still running today, but in a very different format. It's hard to underestate how influential this program was. It was huge. It involved in its peak 40,000 police officers being trained and then embedded within schools, so they worked full-time within schools delivering this program to in total 46 million children in the USA and across 51 countries worldwide. It did come to Britain. It was in the Midlands for a couple of years. At its peak, it was receiving over $200 million a year in funding to train. We had a lot of corporations investing in this. Corporations like KFC, McDonald's, Hewlett-Packard, lots of people behind this program trying to make it successful. And it wasn't just one lesson. As we've seen in the UK, young people today will get about 1 lesson a year, and sometimes that's just a 20-minute talk or inform time, and that's their drug education. With DARE, they had 17 lessons. It was a whole program that was delivered by a police officer. These were the lessons that they would go through. It did change from time to time. This is it from 1988. We're not going to go through all of them because there are just simply too many to go through. It was such a big program. But in particular, you can take a look at this. Resistance techniques, ways to say no. These are techniques young people were taught to use if they were going to say no to drugs, and they role played this in class. One young person would play the role of a drug dealer, one young person would play the role of themselves being offered drugs, and they could try these different techniques to make sure the person would walk away effectively and leave them alone. The idea being, the better you could prepare a young person to say no, the more likely they would be to say no, and we would see drug use decline as a result. And like I say, everyone was really rooting for this. The police, teachers, parents, there was some pushback as well, but ultimately it had a huge amount of support and also cross-party support as well. So it should have been successful. Now, did it work? Sadly, this is what resulted. Drug use continued to climb. In fact, it climbed significantly. Some research even found that the control groups performed better than the groups of students who had taken DARE in terms of drug use. And that's because, as one of the researchers puts it here, they said that DARE did increase student knowledge about drugs and enhance their social skills, but we also know knowledge has very little to do with behaviour. In other words, this is the problem here, that ultimately deciding to take drugs is not just a simple yes-no decision. Equating drug use to a simple lifestyle choice doesn't really reflect the complexities that young people go through when they're actually deciding whether to take a drug. And taking this approach doesn't prevent drug use. And it also doesn't offer support for young people who decide to use drugs. It also leaves them abandoned and vulnerable to any of the consequences that come with that. And finally, it doesn't really try and understand what might be driving these choices in the first place. So for instance, if they're really struggling, what are they struggling with and why? Despite this, it remains popular because it's seen to promote personal responsibility. But we need to be careful with that, because actually a young person might be using drugs because of these issues here, and maybe they shouldn't be made to take personal responsibility for things like searching for their identity or trying to bond with friends or feeling lonely or feeling bored. These are things that actually should be the responsibility of adults in their lives to help them with. This was the approach taken by Iceland. Now, Iceland's really significant because Iceland did have a really significant problem with drugs and drunkenness in their young people. In fact, they topped the charts for this in the 90s, as you can see here. But as you can also see, since the 90s, their drug use and also drunkenness amongst young 15 to 16-year-old students here has fallen markedly. It has really reduced significantly, so they've gone from the highest use to the lowest. And it's worth exploring how they did this. Ultimately, they did it this way. They took a look at this chart here. Well, they didn't necessarily look at this chart, but we're going to use this chart to demonstrate how this happened in practice. And basically, they didn't bother with drug education. Instead, they looked at the young person's whole life, everything they experienced, and they thought about them completely as a person and how they could help them as an individual, rather than just how do we educate them about drugs. They started by listening to young people. That means they do annual surveys. They've got a really high completion rate. About 98% of young people complete these annual surveys. And they do that every year to understand what's actually happening in a young person's life, not just about drugs, but about other things as well, like their loneliness, their well-being, and how they're feeling in themselves. They then use that information to understand how best to support those young people, and they split that over different localities around Iceland. So young people in one region might be supported differently to another region because those young people in different areas are saying different things. They also importantly do this really quickly because the young people who fill out the survey are growing up quickly. So that information is fed back within those localities within 2 months. There are some common themes across the localities though. There's a big emphasis on leisure time. That's because young people have talked about being bored, as our young people have talked about being bored. So they've invested heavily in sports facilities, dance clubs, art clubs, places where they can spend time in adult supervision and bond and find friendships and activities and interests that suit them. We can see this quote here, for instance, from one of the young people who took part in the University of York research saying, well, you've just got to be strong about things. Go to the gym, sort your life out, get a routine, do stuff, read books. There's other quotes in that research as well saying similar things about actually it's really hard being bored, and that's one of the reasons why I struggle with drugs. So we have young people saying something similar. The other big thing is their family time. They really took an emphasis on that. That's encouraging families to dine together, and dining together without your phones is a big part of this, helping them bond, connect and belong together. This is seen as really helpful, enabling a young person to feel that they have a place and they can form a positive identity in that setting, but it also enables them to talk. It gives them those opportunities to have conversations because they're together every day having conversations about lots of things. And as we've seen already, and as we're going to look at here, having a conversation is actually really important to young people. I won't read them all out, but here's loads of quotes that you can see on the screen from young people who took part in that research at the University of York, saying how valuable it was to talk to people and to have someone to talk to. So, for instance, we've got Hannah at the bottom at age 15 saying basically for her what's worked best is having a good chat. I love talking about it because I'd rather keep it out than in. I love chatting. And then you've got Rich second down, basically advising professionals, well, in this case, it is professionals he's advising about how to best support young people. And he says, just speak to them, just see what's going on and why. In other words, do have conversations with us. Now, when it comes to that, there's a lot of great expert advice out here. And the last bit of the session is going through that and summarizing it for you. But we've also got links there to show you where you can go and watch and learn more if you're interested. To begin with, we've got Maya Salvitz. We mentioned her earlier. Here she is in a video all aimed at parents and about how best to support young people. In that video, she says what parents can do most importantly is make kids feel safe. Make kids feel loved, comfortable and safe. If the kid feels safe to run to you if they have a problem, then that's what you want. Her big point in the video is that you can't necessarily stop your young person taking drugs. or the young person in your life or the young person you're supporting, but you can help them feel like you're a trusted adult to turn to. And she said that's basically the main thing that you can achieve through talking with them. Fiona, Dan's mum, says something similar in her video. She says basically try and make it a comfortable conversation, a conversation that both the parent and the child are comfortable to come back to. There's also a really good book on the topic about how to talk to your child about drugs by Owen Bowden-Jones. And the next and final bit of this session is summarising this, the key findings from these experts and what we would pass on to you as attendees of this course about what they say when it comes to having a conversation. Now, first of all, they tell us what conversation shouldn't be. It said it shouldn't feel like an interrogation, and it shouldn't also feel like a lecture. It should really feel like an authentic conversation where the child really feels like they're connecting with you. There are two things to think about when approaching this conversation as an adult. Firstly, what are you going to say? And secondly, what is their experience of you saying it? That's really critical, as we'll come back to, and actually the main thing potentially to focus on to ensure that a young person feels that they can have these conversations and return to them. Now, the guidance we're going to go through is aimed at parents, but it does have a wide application for anyone else who supports a young person. So when it comes to when to have the conversation, Owen Bowden-Jones in particular says there isn't a real clarity in terms of when. Different children mature at different rates, and it's really down to the parents to decide when is best for their child. But he gives the guidance of saying between the age of 10 to 11 is probably a good time to consider for most children to have an age-appropriate first conversation, certainly before they've been exposed to drugs or people using drugs. Also, before drug use has already become a problem. By then, emotions can be running high, relationships can be strained, and opinions on what the solutions are can be increasingly polarised. It can be really difficult then to approach the topic when that is actually happening. Also, when they're prepared for having a conversation, there's some guidance there to say it might be worth telling them you'd like to talk about this with them at some point, but if you do that, make sure they know that they're not in trouble, that this isn't that kind of conversation. And also when you're prepared for a conversation, that means learning the basics and potentially maybe speaking to their school so you know exactly what it is that they're being taught, so you know already what they've been told. Now, during the conversation, it's important to give accurate information. You don't need to be an expert, but young people should be informed about risks, so a basic knowledge about risks is worth having, and that's why we've tried to include that in this session today. Try not to fall into the trap of exaggerating risks. It's understandable why we would want to do that, because ultimately we do want young people not to use drugs. That's the safest thing for them. But we know that exaggerating risks doesn't stop them from taking drugs and actually tends to just make us seem irrelevant to them, because they quite easily can find information that tells us that what we're telling them isn't true. Do make your own views clear. So if you are anti-drug, it's not a problem to explain that you're anti-drug, but it's worth giving them the context for that. In particular, for instance, if they or you have family history of addiction, that could be worth advising them about, because that also means that they have a higher risk of addiction. And that's information that could be valuable for them to make their own decisions about drug use. And mostly stay calm. Young people, we know, worry about how parents or adults in their lives will react during sensitive conversations. And they'll probably drip feed you information to see how you manage the first piece before they give you any more. Staying calm can let them know that it's okay to talk. And finally, after the conversation, try and leave the door open. You don't need to try and say everything in one conversation. In fact, there is advice to say it's better to not do that. Having 61-minute conversations is often better than having one 60-minute conversation, which in itself can feel overwhelming and unlikely the kind of experience a young person might want to come back to. But short little conversations can feel much more comfortable and open up an ongoing dialogue that can be more useful. Do give praise. Acknowledge it can be difficult discussing drugs, so any conversation is worthy of praise. And finally, if you're concerned, think things through really carefully. The advice is not to immediately rush them to the GP or treatment services just in case this is what they need, because we know that that can actually in itself be a harmful act, particularly if the young person doesn't want to attend or if they don't feel they have a problem, particularly if they don't actually have a problem and they've just been experimenting with drugs. Doing this can actually just fracture your relationship with them, which means they won't talk to you again. In other words, seek for more information, talk to them about what their use looks like. Try and understand at what point it is that you do need to go and get that support. And there is advice and support available for you to help make those decisions. As I say, there are leaflets that we hand out with these sessions with useful links, and if you'd like that leaflet, email us and we will email you back that leaflet so you can get more information. Now, in closing, this session you may have thought was about teaching young people about the risks of drugs and how we go about doing that. In part it is, but mostly it's about the value of talking and listening to young people. And that's actually the thing that's come out time and time again through the research, that young people do value these conversations, but they don't know how to have those conversations. And hopefully this session has equipped you to at least start thinking about having that conversation and where you can get further information and support in order to start those conversations. Now, as for learning outcomes, we would suggest there's just a couple of takeaways from this session. First of all, a lot of anxiety that we feel around drugs is actually our own, and that's from the way drugs have been portrayed to us, and it's worth having that awareness of what our anxiety is like and how that impacts our ability to communicate with young people. We know young people often say they trust parents and adult figures for advice, particularly over the internet. So in trying to have a conversation with a young person, you could be pushing on an open door. They may be really not necessarily looking forward, but very open to having that conversation once they feel that actually it's going to be manageable and comfortable and they can participate without a lot of the consequences that we've talked about already. We know young people benefit from small groups where they can chat. They don't want big lectures and they don't want those big kind of settings or don't seem to benefit from those. We know also there's good guidance for having conversations. We've just gone through the very basics today, particularly at the end, but if you would like further information, there's loads of good resources out there. We can also send you the references for this session, which has all the links there for the information we've used today. And if we looked at what's happened in Iceland, we know that bringing adults and children close together does seem beneficial in preventing drug use, probably more so than drug education alone. And that is something to strive for. So your best intervention isn't necessarily about educating a young person about drugs, although we would say that's beneficial. It's also about spending time with them in general. It does seem to have that positive impact. And finally, if you do want further information, we do have those useful links available, but also we have Drink Drug Hub available at drinkdrughub.co.uk. You can come and visit the website at any time, have a look at the resources or book further training. If you would like these leaflets here, then just drop us an email. You can come visit us at the website, drinkdrughub.co.uk. You'll find all the information you need there, including a contact form. And we just want to say thank you for attending this session and watching this video. And if you'd like to watch further videos, they're available on YouTube now. And you can also book live training sessions with us at the website. Thank you.